we have been in a very active pattern over the last week or so, and it looks like we will stay in an active pattern through much of next week and maybe through the rest of August as well. But we will begin to start seeing about average to slightly below average precipitation from average for especially for the east to go in the Midwest. But we'll likely have a same ring of fire pattern throughout next week over the Midwest that will allow for complexes of thunderstorms or thunderstorms in general, probably severe to ride the gradient of a ridge. The ridge placement, according to a lot of model guidance, appears to be further just south of the Midwest, to the southeast portions of the country for next week. Some troughing may be able to push in across the west coast as well, early to middle, maybe the end of next week. That will allow for multiple rounds of thunderstorms, likely severe thunderstorms over the Midwest, and that will ride the edge of the ridge like what we've had so many times this summer. This is a dominating northwest flow pattern that we've had for well over a month now. At times, over the last 2 or 3 months, like all summer long, we've had this stubborn pattern in place, and it looks like we will continue to have more complexes of thunderstorms throughout next week. That is most likely appears to be in the Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri area, and then further east to go. It looks like the plains maybe a little bit on the drier side compared to further east for next week, but that will change as we move towards the end of August. It appears we'll be more active in the plains rather than further east. But showing this troughing, some blue colors into the western portions of the country, while you're bridging the southeast, that typically allows for some troughing to push east into the plains, eject some shortwave troughs into the plains areas. This could be the early start of a second season for severe weather, but again, second season appears to be usually further south into, like the southeast portion of the country or the southern portions of the Midwest. But either way, next week, again, a very similar pattern is what we've been dealing with lately, with ridge riding complexes of thunderstorms on the edge of this ridge over the Midwest and further east into the Ohio Valley them areas. But having some troughing showing up for once in the West does bring some uncertainty of what may actually materialize. This could also increase the chances for a more, I guess, widespread area of thunderstorms and severe weather rather than a localized corridor of severe weather like what we've been dealing with for the last week or two. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise because it is early middle August to begin with during corn sweat season, but we will have plenty of low level moisture in place for next week as well. And we will likely have some gradient setting up. You can see some of these decently sharp gradients setting up on the moisture side of things. When you have dew points up to 80 in portions of the Corn Belt, but further north you go, it cuts off pretty rapidly down to the low 60s. So if you have this gradient setting up next week, you get this ridge riding complexes to happen. So again, there will be plenty of moisture in place throughout next week to get all these severe thunderstorms to happen before we get into a little bit of a quieter pattern. And then taking a look at storm fuel that will be in place as soon as this weekend. We will at the eye this weekend as well with a pretty sharp gradient in place. One portion of the Corn Belt again for this weekend that could allow for some severe to take place. But again, next week we will have more gradient setting up of quite a bit of storm fuel in the Corn Belt region. Especially the middle of next week, it looks like we will have the greatest chances for severe weather. If you look at next week in general, it appears that the middle of next week will have the greatest chances for severe weather, as you have very high storm fuel in place throughout the Corn Belt. But again, capping is always a uncertainty here. Especially at this range, if there's a cap in place, you won't get thunderstorms to actually develop. But it appears that we will at least have some kind of shortwave troughs or some kind of forcing in the mid levels to get thunderstorms to initiate next week and break that cap, especially in the middle of next week. So again, a very unstable air mass will be in place next week into the end of next week to continue this very active pattern. Now this is a look at, again, this is a long range model, so you can't take this to heart, especially at this range. But this model does indicate increased chances for thunderstorms this weekend across portions of Wisconsin and Illinois. Iowa. So maybe Saturday there'll be a chance for severe weather in them areas. And then as we push further into Sunday, maybe further south, but next week, as we get to the middle of next week, we should see these complexes of thunderstorms ride these gradients likely probably into the overnight hours rather than daytime hours because there's always less capping in place in the overnight hours. But again, it seems like this model does have these complexes riding this gradient even as far north as the upper Midwest this period. But again, this could shift further south as we get closer. But just so you know, it looks like we have multiple chances of severe weather once again middle to end of next week because of these complexes of thunderstorms. Now, because of ridges further south next week, it appears that we will have cooler conditions north of the warm front for next week. Temperatures may only rise into the low 70s in quite a bit of areas, which is pretty cool, even from the middle of August. But again, south of the warm front, it looks like we will have very hot and humid conditions. It appears into like the central plains areas. We will have very warm conditions south of the warm front. And it all depends how far north the warm front gets next week, because again, there will be a sharp contrast in temperatures. And again, that's where you can get them ridge running clusters along the gradient, the contrast of temperatures and dew points and storm field, the warm front. North of it, again, you're going to have 60s, 70s for highs, but south of the warm front, you have highs pushing well into 90s to low hundreds. So again, it all depends on exactly where the warm front will set up next week to guess for if you're going to get really hot or not. But because the ridge is further south, I doubt it will get into 90s north of I-90 next week. It could between I-80 and I-90, but the greatest chance is to get into 90s next week. It appears to be along I-80 and southward. That is what it is looking like. But again, this will be pretty far above average for temperatures next week, with temperatures up to about 10 degrees above average the further south you go. But again, temperatures will barely be above average the further north you go in the upper Midwest when you're north of the warm front as well. So again, upper Midwest may have a seasonal week. It depends exactly where the warm front sets up. But again, a pretty active pattern overall. This is a look at the temperatures compared temperatures. This is a look at precipitation compared to average for next week. And again, a pretty active pattern over the Corn Belt next week, with we're looking at a couple inches above the average for precipitation in some areas throughout next week in the Corn Belt region. But again, it all depends on where the exact features go, the exact boundaries will go. Again, the exact placement of if there's any training thunderstorms, and obviously the complexes of thunderstorms. We don't know where exactly those will go at this range in time, not until we get to this weekend or so. But the Corn Belt region will likely be under the gun, though. I would assume it's just we will have a much more confined area once we get to this weekend, because model guidance has always struggled to show the placement of complexes, and now they evolve. That likely won't change in the near future.